Okay, welcome to today's webinar, Ceding Control, Sharing Philanthropy's Power for Equitable Inclusive Relationships, co-sponsored by Funders for LGBTQ Issues. My name is Caitlin Duffy, and I'm Senior Associate for Learning and Engagement here at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, also known as NCRP. NCRP is a research and advocacy organization that was founded to center the voices of nonprofits in communities and conversations about how philanthropy works and is held accountable. For the past 40 years, we've worked to advance philanthropy that benefits and engages marginalized communities and advances systems change. So I want to welcome all of you and give y'all a sense of the folks who are joining us on our call today. There are more than 225 people who registered for today's webinar. So we'll go through quickly and see what types of organizations they represent and the primary region they serve. So you'll see here that half of our registrants represent grant-making institutions, with the majority coming from private foundations, closely followed by nonprofits and consultants. So welcome. We also have a majority of folks working on the national level, representing 35% of registrants. Then we have a good mix of other folks joining who are working in other regions of the country and even internationally. Welcome, everyone. So some logistics for our conversation. There are two features that I'd like for you to be aware of for today's presentation. If you're joining us from a desktop, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see buttons for the Q&A and chat features. Please use the Q&A box specifically to pose questions for our speakers, and use the chat box for comments, resources, or other technical questions that you may have. I will be moderating both of those, and if you have any technical issues or for any reason want to chat me directly, I welcome you to do that. Next, we welcome you to join us on social media. My colleague Jack will be following along via the NCRP Twitter account, as well as my colleague Lisa Rangeli, who was the primary author of our Powermoves guide. So to join that conversation, we encourage you to use hashtag PowerMovesEquity. Another hashtag that's really relevant to this conversation, it's actually shift the power, not share the power. So you'll see that in other slides, but I mixed that up here. So next. So today I'll be providing an overview of our Philanthropy project and the Powermoves guide, specifically the sharing power section of the toolkit that inspired today's conversation. We'll do some introductions before we get into the meat of the conversation, which will be moderated, and we'll also be providing an opportunity for all of you to ask questions through the Q&A box of our speakers before we turn to closing thoughts and other resources. Today, we're honored to be joined by 5 sector leaders, including Alfonzo Wanker, who is co-founder and principal of Team Dynamics LLC and will serve as today's moderator. Alfonzo is a participant in the Powermoves Advisory and Peer Learning Group for Consultants, which is part of a 12-month pilot program for funders and consultants to grant makers who have committed to using and providing user insights on Powermoves. And I want to share some of their beautiful shining faces here. We'll share some more information about these groups in our follow-up email, but wanted to flag, we currently have a request for proposals from seasoned consultants to support facilitation, coaching, and event planning for these 2 groups, and there is still time to apply before the September 30th deadline, so please help us spread the word, and if it's you, consider applying. So next, I'm thrilled to welcome our featured speakers. Michele McMurray is Senior Program Officer for Health and Human Services at the Pittsburgh Foundation. We're also welcoming Jane Liu, founder and CEO of Smarter Good and co-author of the fabulous resource Unicorns Unite, How Nonprofits and Foundations Can Build Epic Partnerships. Next, we have Bill Gallegos, who is co-chair of the Funder Engagement Working Group of the Building Equity and Alignment for Impact Initiative, also known as the B. And Bill's also former executive director of Communities for a Better Environment. Last but not least, we have Lindsay Baer, who's program director for the Native Cultures Fund at the Humboldt Area Foundation. You can read our speakers' full bios on the webinar's event page on NCRP's website, and I have noted some handles here for speakers. Those will also be at the bottom of relevant slides for your easy reference. So before we dig in, some context, and as many of you may know or recall from our first 2 webinars in this series, Powermoves grew out of our Philamplify project, which NCRP created to bring honest, unvarnished feedback from grantees, peers, and other stakeholders to some of the nation's largest foundations to help improve their philanthropy and share learning with the broader sector. So out of Philamplify came our wonderful Powermoves guide, your essential philanthropy assessment guide for equity and justice that hopefully brought you all here today, eager to learn more. Powermoves is not a how-to for equitably, socially just grant making, though NCRP certainly has resources to help you with that too, but rather it's a guide to help funders examine where they are on their journey towards fully embracing equity and justice in grant making operations and leadership. And what's unique about this particular guide is its focus on power. We know that without directly addressing power, we can't make true progress in communities. And in this graphic, you'll see the 3 dimensions of power featured in the guide. And today, we're going to be digging in deeper on some best practices for sharing power through grant making, which is represented in the purple. And NCRP's research has shown that funders who effectively share power with current and prospective grantees and other community members do some of the following. They're highly responsive and transparent. They foster 2-way communication and inclusive decision-making. They also invest in the success of their grantees with multi-year core funds and other trust-building support, such as showing up in the community and sharing connections in the funding world. And they also engage with and solicit input from the communities they seek to benefit, going beyond the usual suspects. And so one of the ultimate power sharing strategies is not just sharing, potentially even ceding control over grant-making resources and decisions with community members, particularly those that historically have had the least wealth, power, and opportunity in our society. So in addition to some of the relevant resources we'll be sending in our follow-up email, I want to flag some forthcoming publications that are relevant to this topic. So next month in October, GrantCraft will release its long-awaited guide, Deciding Together, Shifting Power and Resources through Participatory Grant Making. And this guide will explore the why and how of participatory grant making, which also known by many other names, community-led, community-driven philanthropy. So check it out and learn from funders engaging in this work about their challenges, their models, and the motivations behind this practice. Also this year, GEO is going to publish Participation, Partnership, and Power, a guide to community-driven philanthropy. They're developing resources to consider what is required to center our work on what the community tells us it needs. So stay tuned for these excellent resources. And again, we'll be sending some more in our follow-up email to all of the registrants of this webinar. And there's a plethora of resources available in the Powermoves online library and NCRP's website as well. So what questions do you need to ask yourself and your stakeholders to know how well you are sharing power? Our Powermoves guide has some great tips and questions to ask internally and externally to examine where you are and what your next steps might be. And if you'd like more of the who, what, when, where, why of getting into this guide and how to get started, we encourage you to watch the recording of our first Powermoves webinar from May. And you can also find a recording of our July webinar on the Building Power section of the toolkit. And again, we'll include links to those when we follow up with you. So with that, I'm excited to turn it over to our esteemed moderator, Alfonso.
Thank you, Caitlin, and good morning and good afternoon or good midday, depending on where folks are joining us from. Again, my name is Alfonso Winker. I'm co-founder and principal with Team Dynamics. You can find us at teamdynamicsmn.com. We work regionally and nationally helping foundations and nonprofits think about their racial and gender justice capacity. And I am really excited to hear today from our panelists. So I'm really thinking about my job as the moderator, as someone to really pull out the nuggets of wisdom and the perspective that our panelists have. I'm a part of the Powermoves consulting group, and one of the things that we've talked a lot about is the importance and the hunger and the need for folks to know about how these practitioners on our panel today are incredible when we think about how to do this work. And so before we get into the full conversation, we think it's important for each of you to know who it is you're hearing from today. And so we're going to invite each of our speakers to take just a few minutes, 3-5 minutes max, to introduce themselves and their body of work and really why their body of work is relevant to power. And we're going to go alphabetically for this first round of introductions. So Bill, if you'll start us with your brief introduction.
Thank you, Alfonso. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Gallegos. I'm in Los Angeles, and I represent Communities for a Better Environment, a statewide environmental justice organization in California with the Building Equity and Alignment for Impact project. We call it the B, and it's a national initiative that's about 6 years old that brings together grassroots environmental and climate justice organizations, a number of the big green groups and medium-sized green groups, such as Sierra Club, Union of Concerned Scientists, National Resources Defense Council, 350.org, and others, and a number of foundations, such as Kresge, Solidago, Overbrook, Mertz Gilmore, and others. And we're coming together to try to build a principled alignment between three sectors that have traditionally had a lot of conflicts and division. And the idea is to build this on the basis of environmental justice principles that we call the HEMES principles that respect and value the strategic participation and leadership of the grassroots sector, especially frontline communities, indigenous communities, and oppressed communities of color. And we have kind of two primary tasks that we're engaged in. One is to address the horrendous funding disparity in philanthropy between big greens and the grassroots sector. One estimate is it's about 70-1, but I think that's an underestimate actually. And the other is to provide a principled and safe space to discuss and try to reach common ground on critical issues. And we've done that previously around what had been the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan. Very, very successful multi-year effort to really come to some common ground around an equity program, a comprehensive equity program. Unfortunately, the elections changed all of that. And recently we held another forum in Jackson, Mississippi on the, around the issue of just transition. How do we achieve an equitable and just transition from the fossil fuel infrastructure to a clean energy infrastructure, and build into that an expansion of democracy, social justice, racial justice, and environmental justice. So those are the things that we're working on. I'm the co-chair of our funder engagement group, and we're trying to really address this question of how do we change the power dynamic within philanthropy. It's something that requires a great deal of patience and creativity, but there's no getting around the fact that we have to address the question of racism. Not race, that's too safe of a term. We really have to address the question of the racial inequality and recognize that our particular form of corporate dominance in this country, our particular form of capitalism, is a racial capitalism. It's rooted in the genocide and dispossession of native peoples, the enslavement of Africans, the annexation of half of Mexico's northern territories, the colonization of Puerto Rico, so that the particular shape of our economic system and the institutions that emerged from that have been shaped by that history, and of course the resistance to that. So we feel like, philanthropy is one of the major, it's $1 trillion institution. It's what we would call a mainstream institution, but we know that there are honest people like there are in all of the institutions of society. They really want to change and make it responsive to the changes that are necessary for us to have a country that's really democratic, just, and safe for everyone. So we're glad to be a part of this. I've often mentioned that, back in the day when the Communities for Better Environment was fighting Chevron Corporation in Richmond, California, they have a 3,000 acre refinery there right in the middle of a community that's mostly Laotian, Latino, and African American. And they wanted to do a massive expansion to refine dirtier grades of crude oil. And we led a multi-year campaign with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network and the West County Toxics Coalition to try to stop that project, because it was going to add just tons more of immediately toxic pollutions and about 1 million tons a year of greenhouse gas emissions. And I got a call from the then candidate Jerry Brown, who was going to become governor. And he went into a big arm twisting about, why didn't we just accept a community benefits agreement that would put really about $50 or $60 million on the table for these communities and let the project go forward. And we had discussed this with the community members of the community, and they said, our health comes first. You can't buy this. All of our kids have inhalers. We got people dying of lung cancer, brain cancer at horrendous rates. That's the bottom line. After that, we can talk about the money. So anyway, he kind of, twisted my arm, and I said, I hope you're having this same arm twisting conversation with Chevron. He says, what are you talking about, Gallegos? I'm not twisting your arm. Well, I could have that conversation with Jerry Brown, and he could not close the doors of Community for a Better Environment. But if I had that conversation with some of our main funders, they actually could close our doors. Grassroots organizations are incredibly vulnerable when it comes to this power dynamic, because you can just cut off our funding. If you don't like what we're doing, you can cut off our funding. So we need to create a space where we can have an honest conversation about that, where that power dynamic does not operate. We can be completely honest and really work for systemic change within philanthropy without feeling vulnerable. And we really are very appreciative to NCRP for creating this particular space as the B is trying to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. We're going to move to Jane, and Jane would love to hear your introduction. And Bill kicked us off with that opening question of, essential questions for funders as they reflect on how to share power. So tell us about yourself and your work, and then what are some of those essential questions we should be asking about for funders to share power?
Great, thanks, Alfonso. Thanks, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm in San Francisco, California. And I am a social entrepreneur. So I've started a number of organizations, including Upwardly Global and Smarter Good. And in the course of that, had to do a ton of fundraising as a way to get those organizations off the ground and grow them. And with Smarter Good, the work that we do is around nonprofit efficiency. So we are doing the fundraising, we're supporting the fundraising for, and the accounting and finance for about 35 organizations at any given time. And so, gosh, there's a lot to be said about being in the middle of that relationship between nonprofit organizations and their funders. And so so I ended up working with some peers of mine to write this book called Unicorns Unite, together with my friend and colleague Jessamine from the Peary Foundation, who I've had a long-standing partnership with, and also Vu Lei from Nonprofit AF. And many of you probably follow Vu's blog because it's hilarious and incredibly poignant about shifting the power dynamics in our sector. So when I was thinking about this question of what's an essential question that funders should reflect on when thinking about how to share power, I really wanted to reframe it to say a question that we should all think about. And I had two questions. The first is, can we really all be peers? Can we see each other as peers and part of the same family, if you want to put it that way? And there's a little picture here from our book called The Unicorn Family Tree. First of all, why unicorns? Because Vu decided that all of us who work in the social sector are unicorns. We're these kind of crazy people who get up every single day trying to make things better in the world. Don't give up. We're underpaid for the most part across the whole sector, but we're completely committed to vibrant communities. And that's kind of a mythical, magical creature, this unicorn, all of us. So this is how we picture our family, which is all of us working on this same goal. And I think it's rare that we actually kind of work on having a common identity. We like to put each other in boxes of funder, fundraiser, grant seeker, academic, activist, social entrepreneur. Like we're never seeking to have a common identity. So that's the one question is like, can we be peers? Can we see each other as on the same team? And then the second question, if you could go to that next slide, Caitlin, is really about money. And can we, as a group, stop seeing money as the top of the input hierarchy? So when you think of all the things that go into social change, is money the most important? I don't think it is. Personally, in my experience, money is one input of many, including hope and leadership and risk-taking and community experience. but we all kind of put it at the top as if it's the most important thing to getting social change done. And to the nonprofits on the call, you know, and I see myself, I've always been on the nonprofit side. I think we do ourselves a disservice by making money seem like the most important thing too, in lots of ways that we work. So the final thing I just wanted to share is in the next slide. In the book, by the way, the book is all like colorful drawings done by my co-author Jessamine. So there's not a lot of reading, which I think is important for all of us because we have no time. But we, you know, this is one of the exercises that we just get at the how of like, what does it mean to smash the input hierarchy? Well, as nonprofits, we could go through all of our communications and change the way we talk about it. We could just strip it out of really making it about money that buys outcomes and making it about how support is supporting all the inputs of our work. People, resources, facilities. You know, we usually talk about this as general operating support, but I think to also change the language and just make it more holistic. So that's what I wanted to introduce, was a little bit about the unicorn family as one awesome team, and money not the most important input in social change for us to get. If we believe that, maybe we can get rid of this power dynamic a little bit.
Thank you, Jane, for inviting us all to be part of the unicorn family. Lindsay, I would love to hear about you, your body of work, and what you think some of these essential questions that funders should reflect on when thinking about sharing power are.
My name is Lindsay Baer. I'm the program director here at the Native Cultures Fund at the Humboldt Area Foundation. The Native Cultures Fund was founded by Native community leaders almost 20 years ago now, when they saw all of the incredible cultural work that was going to create community health and vibrancy and resilience in Indian country here in California. And the missing piece was some money. And so they set up the fund as a way to bring that resource into Indian communities that already had so much in terms of other kinds of power. And we're really at the cusp of a cultural revival, which now we're pretty deeply into. The fund has been Native-led, Native-run, all community grant makers. These are our beautiful. The slide is these are our beautiful people. They're grant makers. They're also the people receiving the grant. They're also the people who are helping with technical assistance. They're the people we turn to when we need capacity building workshops. It's all right here. So this is the power, right? The foundation has no power to fuel a cultural revival. We can help out with the cash. These are the people who are doing the real work and have been for us from the start. There hasn't really been a time when the community didn't have power in this. Something I really enjoyed about the title of this webinar today was, it's not just sharing power, it's about ceding control. And that's something different. And I think that's something really interesting to reflect on as funders, is beyond just sharing power, which is a wonderful thing to do. It's wonderful to share it both ways. One of the traditional values that California Indian communities hold, there's 178 tribes in California. There's 178 religions. There's 178 centers of the world. There's over 60 languages still spoken. It's a very diverse place, but there's some things in common. And one of those things is that decisions are made collectively. We don't do things individually. And also that when we talk about power, that power is all related. And so when we talk about ceding control, it's not just about sharing some of the decision-making power, but it really is about, what does that holistic sense of letting go look like? What does it look like to actually hand these resources back to the communities they were taken out of, and trust that in our case, people who have 14,000-year histories of the equitable allocation of resources could do that. So for me, that's the question that the webinar helped me reflect on. I also, the fund is housed at the Humboldt Area Foundation, so we're also a community foundation who, serves this immediate community in sort of every way we can, which is sometimes limited. We also have a lot of donor advised funds, and so we also talk a lot and think a lot about sharing power and ceding control when it comes to having a view of the community and sharing that view and that relationship with private donors who maybe are coming with economic power, but look to us in the best case scenario to share the power of knowledge that's coming out of our communities.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for that reflection on our title and sharing about your work. We're going to close out our introductions with Michele. Michele, tell us a little bit about your work and what some of the essential questions around power for funders you're thinking about right now.
Thank you, Alfonso, and thank you to everyone who's on the call today, on the webinar. I'm glad to be here with you. So Michele McMurray, I'm a program officer at the Pittsburgh Foundation. We are a community foundation that is really taken up a mission of improving the quality of life in the Pittsburgh region. If you've heard anything about Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and this area, a lot of it on the national scene has been about kind of this resurgence, this rebirth, this renaissance as a Rust Belt city who's kind of come back from the dead. A lot of that as a result of investments from a burgeoning tech industry, but also really blossoming university and medical institutions. The flip side of that narrative, of course, is that there's about 30% of our community that is not have access to, is not participating in that renaissance. And we know that that is not just an economic disparity, that's also a racial disparity in our region. And so our role here at the foundation about 4 years ago, we really tried to shift our thinking about what our strategy would be in terms of how we engage around these issues of economic and racial inequity in the region. And we adopted a few values. One was racial equity, one was voice, which is people who are closest to the issue should be at the center of creating solutions, and the other was courage. And at first, I think we thought about the courage of folks who are in community every day, who both represent the struggle of trying to do all that they can and yet face really significant systemic and institutional barriers. But I think what we've come to realize is we were really thinking about how we could be more courageous, how we could face the fear of what it means to have to realize that we've been doing the same work for about 70 years, funding some of the same issues, same organizations, meeting basic needs, and yet we are not necessarily seeing those institutional barriers shift. And so some of that, a response could be what's wrong with the people we fund, what's wrong with the communities that we're supporting. But I think that what the most courageous thing that we could do is really turn the mirror inward on ourselves to figure out how we could be critical lovers of our own institution and say, what is it that we are doing to be the foot of oppression on poor and POC communities. And so that for us has looked like, how do we operationalize these values of racial equity? Is one thing to say that you believe in it. It's another thing to actually look at your own policies and practices and the ways in which you exploit, oppress, and exclude these communities. And so I think that for us has been that work. So a lot of my work has been kind of the traditional grant making that we've been doing around how do we meet basic needs and ensure that people have food and clothing and healthcare. But it's also shifted in thinking about kind of taking leadership for our racial equity work and saying, how do we ensure that our practices and policies reflect our values. And that's really been about looking at us and how we engage with communities. So a few things that have happened is that, and I think this is related to the question I think we should be asking ourselves, is that we had to look at, in order to look at ourselves, we had to look objectively. And that's both looking at our own information and our own data, and then asking other people how to interpret what it is that we were saying. You know, our slogan, which is not on what you see, but it's the power to do good. And I think that the flip side of that, of course, is we also have the power to do harm. And so if we're the only ones looking at our data and we're the only ones interpreting that data, then we can always feel really good about doing good, but never have to actually be accountable for the ways in which we create the context that causes harm for the people. And not out of any ill will, but just our unwillingness to look objectively at ourselves and allow other people to look too. So I think the question, I think that it's important if we're going to do this work and to do it in a way that's accountable, is to ask ourselves, when is the last time we looked at our data and who have we shared it with? And I think that that's a good starting point for a conversation for an institution, but also individually, if you're a program officer, wanting to explore that question, and also even as a nonprofit who wants to do that work.
Thank you, Michelle. I love this critical love, the courage to take a look at ourselves. So we heard just in this opening essential questions around racism and capitalism and naming them as systems that our institutions are built on. We talked about the fact that we're a part of a common identity as unicorns, the relationship between all of our power from Lindsay, and then that courage factor. So that's just a flavor of what our panelists are bringing us this morning and this afternoon. We've prepared a few big questions for a few of our panelists to reflect on, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A in just a bit for all of you. So feel free to chat in your questions. We're going to start with Lindsay and Jane, and we want to talk about these buzzwords of authenticity and trust. They get thrown around a lot, right? But really, what are the elements of authenticity and trust in a funder and grantee relationship if we're really looking at power? And Lindsay, I want to start with you.
Manny Lieris at the Indian Child Resource Center in Oakland had a really great insight that I'd love to share. I was in a room with him, with philanthropists, and we were talking about what does the word decolonizing mean in terms of philanthropy? And Manny said that one of the colonial constructs that he found to be most destructive was distrust, that Native people had come to this relationship with colonists in a trusting way, trusting that there would be honor, trusting that treaties would be upheld, trusting that people were there to be good neighbors or guests, and that trust was broken. And so as a Native person working in a fantastic organization that's doing really good work for Native kids, being met with distrust from foundations who want to put a burden of proof on the folks that we're supporting to prove their impact, to prove that they're doing with their money, to have these really, intense reporting, that just compounds the colonization problem. That is just reinforcing this idea that that the relationship should be distrust. And also, he really pointed out that wasn't earned, on the part of their grantees. And I would say for the people that we work with, they're inherently trustworthy. And so I think going into that reporting process, looking at our reporting in terms of, can we come from a place of trust? Can we come from a place assuming that the people who are applying are authentic, that they are trustworthy, that we don't need 50 pages of burdens of proof, that they are going to be doing good work, and that it's our job to understand their theories of change. It's our job to understand what they say impact is. Dr. Kutcher-Risling-Balding at HSU, who runs the Native Studies Department, has this great theory that she would like $1 million and to change one life. And that's impact, and that's what it costs. And I love that idea that, you know, looking to the people who are doing the work to tell us what trust, what impact, what authenticity looks like. And then on our part, being open, you know, being open about power, being open about the fact that we do work in a capitalist system that, you know, for us working in Native communities, and I think in a lot of communities of color, being open that we know where the money comes from. You know, we know that all capital built in this country was built on the blood of slavery and the genocide of Indigenous people. And that's where it started. Where it goes now, you know, that's up to us. But I think there's a certain openness that we need to come with to be trustworthy, at least in the communities that I work in. You know, being clear about knowing what our limitations are and where our power comes from.
So I'm hearing this, the necessity of belief, history, legacy, construction, right? And so Jane, can you build on this conversation about authenticity and trust, and maybe even talk about signs you look for, or formal and informal ways folks are doing?
Jane, you're muted.
Hi, sorry about that. I was having a little conversation with myself over here. Okay, so Alfonso, you were asking about building on that conversation. So, you know, I wanted to go back to the idea of ceding control that Lindsay had brought up earlier, because I think that that's really where a lot of this trust stuff plays out in a practical sense, right? It's in the letting go of control, and so in our book we actually talk about, we you know, do the typical nonprofit thing where we're looking at what are the root causes of the problems that we have in these partnerships between funders and fundraisers, and we came down to, you know, money, that foundations still believe it's their money even though it's been put into the public good. They still treat it like every dollar is theirs, and the other was trust and distrust, and sort of all the picture of distrust, which is between foundations, between nonprofits. Like there's a whole cycle of distrust there. It's not just in one direction. And then the third thing was double standards, that there are standards for transparency for nonprofits where we, you know, have to share all of our information, but not transparency standards on the foundation side, where they're able to share kind of what they feel comfortable sharing. Back to Michelle's point around data. So, you know, some practical things, some very practical things around ceding control and building trust. We talk a lot about, you know, valuing all the inputs, including time. And in the nonprofit sector, it feels always like funders' time is valued, but nonprofits' time doesn't have value necessarily. Very pragmatic things, like funders can when they schedule meetings, you know, ask to schedule it around the convenience of the nonprofit. I know in my experience that that's never happened. Actually, it's really rare that a funder would say, I know you're really busy, when would you have time to meet? It's usually that they provide me with a set of times when they can meet. And it already in that first interaction sets up this idea of control, you know, that they control their calendar, but that I don't have control of my calendar. So that's just like a super pragmatic one. I think the other piece about trust, though, is empathy. And on the nonprofit side, I think sometimes we have a lack of empathy of the control factors that our peers and friends in the philanthropy sector work under. So they have boards of directors, just like we do. And I think one of the exciting things about this book is that a lot of my philanthropy peers have shared with me that they don't feel like they have control inside of the power dynamics with their board. In fact, they feel that same way that we feel with our funders, that we can't be totally transparent and that we don't have control. They feel like that with their board. And so if we could get to a place of more empathy around that, I think our relationships could be more authentic, because we feel those same constraints of control and power, and none of us like how that feels.
Thanks, Jane. I want to shift a little bit to some of this conversation that's been coming up. We've talked about reporting a bit, data, impact, how do we know? And so Michelle and Bill, I'd like for you to have a conversation. We often think of feedback in terms of funders collecting and consuming feedback and stories. How can grant makers and their partners share information in a more multidimensional way? How can they receive, believe, and shift behavior based on what they've learned? And Michelle, I want to start that question with you.
Yeah, yes. So I think that, one of the things that I've learned through some of the work that we've been doing around trying to improve our supports for small nonprofits and small Black-led nonprofits, and also better support for grassroots social justice workers, has been around the need to really not rely on those traditional survey, focus group, final report kinds of ways of communicating. One of the things that for me was really uncomfortable, so you talked about, was around social media. So I was getting requests. So one of the things I realized, like the relationship was shifting, was that I started getting requests from folks to be my friend on Facebook. And I would really think about, like, should I accept this request? And then I recognized that this was an opportunity for me to be in a different kind of relationship with the folks that I was working with, some of whom weren't even like grantees at that point. And it provided me an opportunity to learn with and from them in a way that was a lot more natural, less forced, and where they were clearly making decisions about what they were sharing. I actually saw it as an invitation from them to want me to know them differently, but also a request for them to know something about me that they couldn't get off of the website on my bio. And so that was challenging, I think, both institutionally. So what does that mean? As an institution, is there liability around that? What happens? So there's, professionalism, they may see you in a way that they ordinarily wouldn't see you. But the fact of the matter is that we're often asking our grantees to come in and undress for us, to be vulnerable and to get naked and to tell us things about themselves and their organizations and sometimes about their lives. People feel like they have to come in and tell you about the things that happened to them that brought them to this work, that then might express to you that they're credible and that they're trustworthy, to your point, Lindsay. And so it was one of those exchanges where, well, I guess I have to put myself in the position of being more vulnerable to experience what it may be like for them. And so it's been great, though. Sometimes I learn things that I don't want to know, particularly about how they feel about philanthropy. It's not always, and for me to learn not to take it personal. So after engaging in some of the learning that we've done together, I now see our grantee partners or activists that we've worked with talking about philanthropy as an institution and its impact on them and on their communities. That's data. Like, I don't even think I could get that kind of data if I tried to bring them into a focus group. And I'm not just getting what they're saying, but there's a whole thread of feedback from people who they represent, who see them as a leader, and oftentimes they are thought leaders, that's helping to then inform my understanding of how we're showing up, not even like specifically the Pittsburgh Foundation, but philanthropy more broadly. And then it gives me a lens through which I can then evaluate what it is that we're doing. So if they're talking about, reporting and the fact that they don't think anybody reads it, And I have to think like, oh, I do have this backlog in my office of final reports I haven't quite read yet. And did they hear back from me? And so I think that kind of feedback has been important. The last thing that I'll offer, and then I'll let Bill talk a little bit about what he's experienced, is the importance of what we've launched, which is around this idea of being more than money. So we have tried to be really intentional through our work, particularly with our small nonprofits, around creating opportunities for us to engage that's not about the asking and the receiving of money. So what are the non-monetary ways that we can engage around mutual interests, or around things that they've just said that they want? That could be networking events with other funders that they've asked us to curate, so we've done, but they're social. They're not, there's no pressure on them. There's no pressure on, you know, funders. It's just an opportunity to get together. We've gone to dinner together just to have dinner, not with the expectation of anything. I mean, we pay for it, but outside of that, you know, we do that. We have an event coming up where we're going to be talking about voter and voter engagement. Not necessarily that they're expected to do anything or that we're expected to do anything, but it was just a topic that they were interested in learning more about and bringing some folks in for that. And then going to their events and convenings, even when they don't invite me, right? Like I see it on social media, there's an invitation, I hear about it through another network. I don't have to wait to be invited to go to something that they're doing that's public. And that's another way of gathering information and to get feedback from them. But it's also a way for them to share with us, inviting them into spaces that maybe previously they hadn't been invited into, just for them to observe, not to be there, to be on display, to be the act of the hour, or to entertain, but just to be a participant in the same way that I'm being a participant in that space, but maybe they wouldn't have been able to get access to without the invitation from somebody who was already invited. And so all of that is information sharing in a way that's not formal, but we're both learning, going through a learning experience together.
I'm really appreciating, Michelle, this conversation inviting around showing up, being in relationship in different ways. And so, Bill, I want to invite you to build on this conversation around feedback. How should we be gathering multi-directional feedback that is beyond a survey, beyond a focus group?
Well, thank you, Alfonso. And I really appreciate what Michelle was sharing. I think there's a lot in there that is so valuable and so precious. I want to talk a little bit, I want to build up a little bit on what Lindsay was saying. I know we say it's not the money, but this is, as an old organizer, I'm saying if we want to make this happen, it has to be more than a one-off conversation. I think it has to be well organized. It has to be something where there's an extensive commitment beyond we just get together once in a while and have a conversation. So I think that's the thing, is how do we build a consistent interaction between folks from oppressed communities and philanthropy? So I think that's one thing. Maybe, one experience we have is we're trying to organize regional funder briefings. But I think this is something that it takes resources. You can't ask grassroots folks to just come out and come to a meeting. They need childcare. You should feed folks. It should be culturally relevant. It should be something exciting for people. And if you've got 50 indigenous languages in California, you should take that into account so people can feel confident that they can express themselves in their own language. That takes resources. And you're asking people to take time out. People don't just show up to a meeting. Somebody has to organize it. Somebody has to get the place. The place usually ain't free. So I'm just thinking that if we want this kind of connection and really engagement and an honest discussion, then that does take resources. So I think it's something, and I don't think it's something that, one foundation can do it, but it seems to me like this should be a collaborative project. Grassroots folks, we're always being asked to collaborate. And sometimes there's not the additional resources we need to do it, but we're saying you have to build this as a collaborative. We don't see that same kind of collaboration a lot of times from philanthropy, but this is an area where I think there could be a collaborative project. So part of that is just, so we can reach grassroots organizations, talk to them about this. What do they want this conversation to look like? This takes time. It takes effort. It takes, people being able to do this who have the respect of those communities, who can go out and have that conversation. And then it needs to be organized. What do we want to get out of these conversations? So one of the things that we're often hearing from philanthropy, there's a lot of really, I think, very principled and honest program officers that we worked with, and we really so much value that. But we're always told, the big shot callers are upstairs. It's the CEO, it's the board. We could really use your help in how do we reach these folks. So if we set up a community conversation, how do we get some of your board members? How do we get your CEO and some of those folks there? The folks who really ultimately make the decisions about where money goes, and who need to hear from these communities. And I think also that I really agree with what Michelle's saying. It's not just you need to hear from, here's what we're doing, here's what's going on. You need to hear their questions. How do you guys make your decisions? How come this big green organization gets $50 million and this organization over here, which is doing incredible work, got $25,000? We need to be able to have those kinds of honest conversations. And, but we want to have them because we have them with program officers, and I think they, a lot of them, they want to do their best. They're fighting the good fight. But sometimes they just run up against a wall that, together, maybe we can kind of breach that wall. But we need to find a way how to get people that have not been engaged in this conversation, engaged in that conversation. How do we get the folks that, they're used to funding their country club buddies? And how do we get them into the room, or at least some of them, where they can really, we can begin an honest conversation, and it should not be one-off. Wow, that was a great meeting, and we really love that, and we're going to take this back and give it some serious thought. We should think about how do we make these consistent conversations and expand them as we go forward.
Appreciate that, Bill. We're hearing these themes around listening, believing, multiple conversations, showing up, participating in a way that doesn't center my culture and identity and background, but appreciates who it is that I'm calling to the table. And once we have that information, once we're in those relationships, then what, right? We have pivots to make, we have choices to make, shifts to make. And so I'm curious, and we'll talk with Michelle and Lindsay on this one, and maybe we'll have time to hear from Jane and others, but have you gotten input? So when we think about this listening, this believing, this showing up, have you gotten input from communities and grant partners that have then informed strategy? Or what have you observed other funders doing, that not just the listening, but the believing part and then the shifting part? And how can folks really make those pivots? And why don't we start with you, Michelle, on that one?
Sure. So there are two projects that I've had the opportunity to lead over the last 2 years. One is our Small and Mighty Grants program. So that one started after looking at our data, again, turning the mirror inward and saying, what does it look like? What is our support for small nonprofits? And we said, organizations with budgets under 500,000. What does that look like? We know that in our Pittsburgh region, the average budget size for all nonprofits is about $463,000. And there are 2,100 nonprofits in the region. What we found when we looked at our data was that we were primarily funding organizations with budgets over $1 million. Small nonprofits made up only 16% of our grants and 14% of our grant dollars. So they're 2/3, small nonprofits are 2/3 of all nonprofits in the region, but they were like less than a quarter of who we were funding in our portfolio. So again, this idea of like looking at our data, we can't interpret that by ourselves. So one of the things we first said was, what is it that we're doing that keeps people out? And then we went and actually asked these small organizations, some that we funded and some that we didn't, what do foundations do that makes it hard for you to get access to our resources? And I won't take you through all the things, but there were lots of things that we do that was intentional about not lifting up the strengths of these smaller organizations. It was not recognizing the context in which they function and seeing how they are actually a necessary part of the ecosystem of our community. And so we actually worked with them based on their feedback to actually design the grants program, took the design back to them and said, did we get it right? And we've been working with these organizations consistently over the last 3 years to not just get the money now, but to help us to continually improve upon the processes that we're using. Is this working for you? Is this not working for you? Things like, we thought this was a simplified application, but in actuality, it's not that much different than what we were doing before. How do we tweak that? You're asking, it's only a $15,000 grant. Why are you asking, 15 questions on your final report? And it was things like, we need more than money. Like, the money's good, but we need more than this. And being very intentional about, is this going to be some set aside fund and this is all they ever get from us, which is also not equity. And we were like, well, thank you for asking the question. And no, I guess not. How do we ensure that there's a pipeline for you to not only get access to more money here, but through our other foundation partners? So that's been an ongoing iterative process, but they've been at the table with us consistently, helping to inform what that looks like. Say the other project has been the Social Justice Fund. 2016, November happened, and lots of things had been happening before that as it relates to injustice, but the profile of these issues was just at a point, and we were looking at all of the grassroots activity that was happening across the country, folks mobilizing, and we realized that when we looked at our portfolio, again, our own data, none of these organizations were represented in what we were doing. So a colleague of mine, we actually just went on social media and we were like, who's doing the work? Because we knew, like, if you look at the research, like, this is a tool, an organizing tool that's used. We knew that it wasn't folks that we already knew who were doing the work. So we were like, how do we find them? So we were like newspaper clippings, so Twitter, Facebook, asking friends and family. And we came up with a group of 10 people that we had never funded before who were doing this work, and invited them into a space with us so that we could understand their critiques. But we let them we had a panel, but then we also gave them space to decide what the questions for the day would be and to organize their own small groups for the day. And out of that grew this idea that they had 2 requests from us. One was that we gave them money to convene themselves without us. And the other was that we were intentional about dedicated grant support for them. And they also said we shouldn't be doing this by ourselves. So we invited them to participate as part of a design committee. And they actually went through a 5-month process with us where we learned about other funds that were happening around the country. And they decided the parts that worked, that they thought would apply to Pittsburgh. There was some, of course, compromise between institutional priorities and their very radical ideas about how philanthropy should function. But we worked through that, not without conflict, but we worked through that. And I think the ability to work through conflict is a sign of an authentic and a trusting relationship. That we got to the point where we did design a fund. We got the board to approve the fund, and we just launched our first round of grants. We have an advisory board that's also made up of activists who advise on the grant making component of that, as well as the more than money stuff, which is also part of this, which is additional supports for activists. So it can be done. And I think the question about the discomfort, how do you lean into it? You just have to decide that you trust people. In this case, it was Black and Latinx women. And we just had to say, like, do we trust women of color? Do we trust them to make good decisions? Do we trust them to know what's best for themselves and for their community? And if we do, then we need to learn to follow and not always lead.
Well, Lindsay, I saw you smiling in the corner there, and I know you all are thinking a lot about this community-led grant making. So let's build on that question of discomfort. You all have a practice of ceding the control and the decision making. What advice, strategies, suggestions, tools do you have for funders that are thinking about actually living into that discomfort of letting someone else make the decision?
I loved what Michelle said about you just do it. Like you get on social media, you find the people who are doing the work. Like leaning in is you just do it. For us, we do have kind of this long history of community grant makers, which means that we convene groups of culture bearers and they make all the granting decisions. I serve as an information portal, and that's it. I help them understand what it is, but and it takes a certain amount of internal letting go. But I really think when we're talking about building trust, and this I love this question that, like, what do you do once you get this information in? Because that's what being trustworthy is. It's saying, if you spend all the time to tell us all of your brilliant ideas, we're actually going to do something with it. There's a great Karuk leader here, Julian Lang, who once said to me, we were talking about leadership and had this really heady discussion, and he said, leadership is just doing what you said you were going to do. And I think, if we go out, like Bill said, and ask people to tell us all of their great ideas, we have to feed them. You have to make it worth their time. And then we have to do something with it to be trustworthy. And so for us, we do the community-based grant making. Right now I'm in the middle of a big listening campaign. So I have a fabulous evaluator, Dina Dart, this great Chumash woman that I'm traveling all over the state for a year with, having dinner and talking to people and finding out kind of what they want. And then what we do with that at the end is that's our plan. So things that have come out of it for the foundation are things like the Equity Alliance, which is a racial equity training that the foundation actually provides to all sorts of institutions and systems leaders in the area. Because what we saw as a pattern in our grant making is that racial inequity was underlying all the problems. And so instead of finding someone else to do it, we brought people in and we do it. The foundation, Humboldt Area Foundation, has incubated the True North Organizing Network, which is a community organizing network led by Native people, but that serves all the people in this area. And that was one of the things that we heard, is that there needed to be more of a network of community organizing. And they all do listening-based organizing. So that kind of spun out. That's not a traditional community foundation thing. We heard that there was a real disconnection between our donors, what they understood of the community. We heard this from donors and from program staff and from the people who we were serving, that we, to Bill's point, we, the program officers, were an intermediary, and that wasn't always efficient. And so one of my colleagues, Ron White, started these great donor circles here where our donors have a space to get together, to be supported, to talk about big issues, to learn about them. Just because people have resources doesn't necessarily mean that comes with all of the social knowledge of how to best allocate them. And so there are these safe spaces where donors can talk about things like racial equity, housing and homelessness, and then as a collective decide what they want to do. And they go out into the community. We help facilitate their going out to the places that maybe as individuals they wouldn't know where to go or be welcome or feel welcome or know how to walk in that way. So those are different ways that we had sort of heard problems from our community and then tried to find ways to address them. In the Native cultures work, we heard that there's not a lot of money out there for language revitalization. It sort of falls in between education and arts, and if you don't speak more than one language, or especially if you're not familiar with indigenous languages, it's hard to understand that it's not just a set of words, it's an entire cosmology and way of being that are in the structure of these languages. And if the language is lost, that is lost, and it's very detrimental to a community. And so we started, my predecessor here started a wonderful language institute for the teachers, the people who have the bits of these languages, who are bringing them back. It's this wonderfully supportive weekend week where we bring them together. They share learning, they share resources, we share, all of the connections that we can about ways to find funding for something that's difficult. So it's one program. Something that came up recently that we heard from our Native communities that was important was having access to land. Land for Native people. I mean, land access is important for all people. For Native people, when you're talking about their homelands, their ancestral lands, you're talking about their churches, you're talking about their universities, you're talking about our grocery stores. This is where you go to pick your food and your basket materials. And, there's only specific sites that you can go to have ceremonies. So access to these lands really is access to your way of being. And often, these sacred sites or these gathering sites are on private land or public land that aren't accessible. It's not a traditional thing that we would do as a grant maker, but it happens that we know people who have these land access. We have these connections. We know the people who need access to this land. So we're facilitating discussions about land repatriation and cultural easements on land. We have the attorneys that know these things. So I know that was a laundry list of examples, but I think the overarching point is you do it in any way that the community asks. The community asks for something and you find a way case by case.
Thank you so much for that, Lindsay. I think when we're in institutions, when we're wrestling with our own power, it can be so comfortable to live in the analysis. So thank you for helping us think about, there's so many doors and windows to come through, a bigger menu of options when we think about ways to move through that discomfort and get to work. Don't live in that analysis. I see there's some questions coming in from our participants. So we're going to get to some of these questions. There's a handful of them. And so panelists will probably ask 1, 2 max responses and try to keep it to a couple of sentences so that we can get to all of the curiosity of our participants. I'm going to drop a couple of the questions here. This one's from Elizabeth, and she's wondering, what are some examples of that objective analysis of foundation data to identify a foundation, where a foundation might be doing harm, and what has that revealed? Who wants to take that one?
That sounds like it might be related to something that I may have said. So I think that any place, briefly, where a foundation is excluding or erecting barriers that make it more challenging for certain parts of our community to get access to its resources. And that's both financial capital, intellectual capital, reputational capital of the institution, then we're doing harm. Because we're consciously or unconsciously, through our policies and practices, making decisions about who should or who is deserving of the money that may not be based in anything that is factual. It's just a bias or a belief that we may have about a certain group of people or about certain communities, who's deserving or not deserving, who's trustworthy or not trustworthy. So I think that if you look at your data, and you find ways to assess who's getting the money and who isn't, that's a way in which you're doing harm, especially if you don't have a really good objective reason for not doing it. And so that, for me, that's been for us one of the most significant examples of how we may be, and really unintentionally, we were doing harm, because there was really nothing except our own practices that were keeping people out.
Thanks, Michelle. This next question is from Terry, and it's a question about internal management. And so Terry says, I'm interested in the seeding control while working within internal foundation management, where financial controls in terms of accounting and auditing seem to clash with the letting go concept. And I think so many of us have heard this before, that maybe there are generally accepted practices or systems in place when it comes to our financials. And so the letting go of power, the ceding of power may actually bump into or appear to bump into the financial management of the institution, which I think for many of us, we know that is untrue. But can some of you talk about the ways in which you're navigating internal financial management and what some of those perceived barriers might be?
Well, I'll take a shot at maybe I hope I am understanding this correctly, but the sense that I think a lot of organizations from oppressed communities feel is funders don't trust us with money, not with a lot of money. And what we have found, and what, you know, I think this is objective, is that these organizations know better how to budget, how to be cost effective, how to achieve impact with very little than a lot of the big organizations. And then in this case, I'm talking about within the field of environment and environmental justice. So I think it's helping to, I don't know how to change that understanding that a lot of the foundations have about what is good money management and who do you trust. So I think this, you know, Lindsay said this earlier, you know, part of the colonization thing is you see oppressed people or some, you know, the dominant folks can see oppressed people as not as smart, not as intelligent, not as whatever. And so this carries over into philanthropy where, you know, we can't, you know, you've only had a budget of $150,000 and you want us to give you $150,000? What the hell are you talking about? So I think, you know, we have to, I think help people understand just how, you know, what do we mean by financial management? And, you know, I think I don't know exactly how to turn that around, but maybe that's worth a discussion in and of itself. And I think a related discussion is how do we change what people see as important metrics? So within the field that the environmental justice community works in, is that the myopic focus of a lot of funders, especially some of the major funders in the environmental field, is on greenhouse gas reductions. So our communities are fighting on so many levels. In Flint, when they're fighting for just safe drinking water, that ain't just about greenhouse gas reductions, but that's a hugely important environmental issue that affects literally thousands of communities throughout this country. But how do we change this myopic focus on a very narrow set of metrics that often exclude grassroots communities and oppressed communities?
Can I jump in on and this is just kind of a nerdy practical on that question, is learn what IRS regulations actually are, and that really helps with conversations with your finance people. And then just building those relationships with the folks in your finance department to be able to talk to them about, you know, what are we required to do and what are we choosing to do when it comes to financial oversight? And then if we're making these choices, what are they based on?
Absolutely. So much of what I think our practices have become on the financial side of the house is cultural, just what we've always done, rather than actual legal practice. So we have a question about boards coming in, which I'm sure a lot of folks are thinking about, and I'm going to ask Jane to take this one. How do we work with boards to better advance practices around ceding power, relinquishing power, when oftentimes boards can be sort of the perceived seat of power, or maybe even perpetuate the bad side of power dynamics?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a big question, both for nonprofit boards and foundation boards, which, you know, I think that on the foundation side, there's still a feeling of it's their money, and so they get to decide where it goes. And on the nonprofit side, I think there's a feeling that if we all spoke up for what we want and ask for what we want, that the funders will say no. So we're too afraid to jeopardize that. One of the things I've seen foundation boards do is to have an advisory board that includes a lot of grantees, and to invite a member of the board to come to those advisory board meetings and to hear from the grantees' perspectives directly, right? And not in a site visit, or not something that feels like it's put together for the board member to see, but in a conversation where that group has been asked to comment on the strategies and practices of that foundation. It's super rare, actually. I've been a part of one of those advisory boards in my career, but I've seen how it has actually shaped the board and helped our our friends who are the EDs of foundations to shape their board. And on the nonprofit side, I think that boards don't really interact with foundations frequently enough to understand, sort of some of the constraints. And any chance that nonprofit boards can have a chance to go to foundation meetings is great. And one of the things that I've seen is really great is board members who don't really know the rules of philanthropy and kind of approach it like any other meeting. So, I used to have a board member who was very much in sales, and she would go to philanthropy meetings with me, and she would ask really smart, direct questions like, oh, it seems like this is a great fit. So will we hear about the grant today? And, it was kind of funny because, in philanthropy, it doesn't work that way. There's like a whole long grant cycle. But I think sort of challenging, like bringing people with the beginner's mind into it that challenge those practices that all of us kind of let pile up on top of us is one strategy. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Jane. This will be our last question from the audience. This one's specifically for Michele. Kelly's curious what, if you could go over what some of the things that small orgs are asking for beyond the grant specifically.
One major thing is around the opportunity to develop relationships with funders. I think one of the things that someone said was that people give to who they know. And so even though we hope that philanthropy ain't fair, but if it were, fair would look like that no matter who you were, whether you had a personal relationship or not, that your LOI would be enough. It wouldn't matter who was on your board. It wouldn't matter, if they recognized your name or your face. What you presented on paper, if it, met the criteria, that it would get a fair shot. But the sentiment is, and I think we know this to be true, that historical relationships and networks often do play a significant role in who gets access to the money. And so one of the things they asked of us and that we've been trying to be intentional about is creating opportunities for our grantees and small nonprofits to have opportunities to interact with funders in low pressure, low risk situations where they actually have more control over what those interactions are like and have an opportunity to have conversations person to human, not across the funder table. So that's one thing. I think that they want grant applications that, quite frankly, make sense, particularly for what they do. Don't ask about questions like sustainability. I have a budget of $43,000. Sustain what? What exactly do you want me to sustain? I'm going to just come back. My sustainability strategy is to come back and ask you for more money. And so don't ask me questions that I'm going to give you a response to that's not going to match what a large, well-resourced, organization with multiple funding streams is like. Don't put me up against that and not look at me in context. They're also looking for things, around this issue of financial management. Give me the money to manage my money, right? It takes money to manage money. And part of the reason why you're getting this budget on a Word sheet, maybe scribbled by hand, is because I don't have computers that work. My internet access is shaky because I don't know when I'm going to be able to keep it on. And I didn't go to school for this. What I went to school for was to do, or what I, learned in my community was how to help in this particular area. I didn't say I was good at financial management. So if you want me to do that and you want to see it presented in a particular way, give me the resources that will help me to give you what you want. But don't penalize me for essentially your own practices, which have often been exclusionary, have not given access to resources, and have me in a position where I can't offer that. So those are a few of the kinds of things that folks ask for.
Thanks for that, Michele. And thank you to our audience for all of your thoughtful questions. Our panelists are going to share their final thoughts. We've had an incredible conversation about the context of racism, capitalism, and colonization that we're situated in. We've come back to this theme of believing the truth of folks on the ground. We've talked about a big menu for action, that there's so many ways to get started, and that part of ceding power is not centering our own comfort as funders. And so I'm wondering, in a sentence, panelists, can you send us off with some of your wisdom? And we're going to start with Bill. Bill, your closing sentence for our folks on the webinar today.
Well, thank you, Alfonso, and thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your putting the time into this discussion. I guess what I would say is, you know, for you all that are on this webinar, it shows that you have an interest. This is a topic that really means something to you. And if you're not an organizer now, become an organizer. Help us change philanthropy in the way that it needs to be changed. Get involved with NCRP, get involved with Building Equity and Alignment, or other institutions that are trying to make this change. Do what you can do on your own, but we know just as organizers that it's social movements that make the difference. So really that's what I would say is, work with us, become an organizer, see yourself as an organizer, not just as a program officer, not just as a consultant, but someone who is going to help us really transform this institution.
Thanks, Bill. Jane, your final thoughts.
My thoughts were just that we're all one team. We're all on this team together, and that each person could take one step just to ask for what you want, and then also to be the kind of partner that you want to have. That's it. But I really appreciate being part of the conversation.
Thank you. Lindsay, how about you?
You know, if we're here talking about thinking outside of the box, colleagues shared an idea. What would happen if we thought way outside of the box? What if no charitable asset was allowed to be kept after the donor passed, and all assets had to go back to the community out of which they came to be distributed by the community as they saw fit? You know, what if we thought of ceding control in a really big way? And so my final thought is I'm really applauding all the people who are thinking about this, not just within the conventions that we have, but thinking about it as something that is much more wide open. Thank you.
Thank you. And Michelle, your thoughts, and then we'll go back to Caitlin for some closing logistics.
I think this one just goes out to the program officers who are watching, or who are here with us. I think that sometimes the seat we sit in, I think Bill mentioned, we're kind of in between. And sometimes feel like maybe we don't have the power to make the change. Someone's going to tell us no, not now, not ever. But do the first next thing you can do. You do have some power. Find that and channel it and use it for all it's worth. Because the only other option is to do nothing. And you're not on this call because you want to do nothing. You want to do something. So find your power and use it.
Well, it's been my pleasure to moderate all of you and listen to your wisdom. Thank you for your time. Caitlin, tell us what we should be paying attention to next.
Thank you so much, Alfonso, for your expert facilitation. Michelle, Lindsay, Jane, and Bill really appreciated this rich discussion. Wanted to close us out by reminding folks that Powermoves and conversations like these are built on extensive work of folks who came before us. And in this specific project, we looked to past research from NCRP, from our partners at Change Philanthropy, including our co-sponsor funders for LGBTQ issues, other grant makers and research and advocacy organizations, including one network I'd lift up is the Funding Exchange that for decades really led incredible work on activist-led grant making and really sharing and seeding power. And so we encourage you to check out the online Powermoves reading list to learn more and see other resources that can inform your journey. And we'll be sharing some more in the follow-up email as well. And if you haven't already, feel free to share some other relevant resources that you found helpful in the chat box, or you can shoot those to me by email. I saw Sally and Molly shared some thoughts in the chat. So thank you to all of you for joining us live and who participated in the Q&A and chat box. And thank you to our speakers and co-sponsor who helped make this conversation possible. For those who are representing nonprofits and grant-seeking organizations on the conversation today, if you want to learn more or recommend a funder to use Powermoves, my colleague Janae Richmond would love to hear from you, and I'll include her contact information in the follow-up email. And we also have some Powermoves blog posts coming out, so I'll include some other content for you to continue thinking about this topic. Next week, you'll receive a follow-up email with a list of resources that were mentioned in this presentation, including the webinar recording and a recap blog post written by my colleague Lisa Rangeli, who did some excellent live tweeting on social. And our next Powermoves webinar will be held the last week of November. It'll be focusing on the wielding power section of the toolkit and what it looks like to leverage all of the assets that a foundation has at its disposal, including its social capital and its public leadership. So stay tuned for more information on that. And we invite you to stay engaged with us and join NCRP in our movement to transform philanthropy, either as a nonprofit member, a foundation supporter, or as a champion ambassador for our Powermoves project. So contact me and others here at NCRP to learn more about how you can stay engaged, and we're happy to be a thought partner and coach to you with our Powermoves guide. So next up, please fill out the webinar feedback survey that will appear on your screen. And thank you again to our moderator, our speakers, and all of you. Enjoy the rest of your day.